The morning Serena Calloway walked into the Hargrove Grand and told the man standing quietly by the front desk to move aside because he was blocking the entrance. That was the morning everything began to unravel. She didn't know who he was. That was the part that haunted her later, when she replayed it over and over in the silence of her office. She simply saw a man in a worn canvas jacket, holding a folded piece of paper in both hands, standing just close enough to the revolving door that guests had to angle around him. So she said what she always said when something was out of place in her hotel. "Sir, you're in the way." He stepped aside without a word. Serena moved on. She had a 10 o'clock with the renovation contractor, a noon call with the regional VP, and somewhere between those two things she needed to review the Q3 occupancy numbers that her assistant had flagged as concerning. The man in the canvas jacket didn't register beyond those 2 seconds. She had a hotel to run. The Hargrove Grand had been the crown jewel of downtown Halifax for 40 years. 12 floors, 218 rooms, a rooftop bar that overlooked the harbor, and a restaurant on the ground floor that had held a National Dining Award for 6 consecutive years. When Serena had been brought in as general manager 3 years ago, the property was bleeding quietly. Occupancy in the low 50s. Staff turnover that had become almost embarrassing. A kitchen that still ran on paper tickets. She had fixed all of it, methodically, sometimes brutally, and the Hargrove was now sitting at 78% occupancy year-round, its restaurant booked 2 weeks out, its rooftop bar mentioned in every travel piece written about the city. She was proud of what she'd built. She had a right to be. What she didn't know, what no one had told her, because the board had decided, in its particular way, that it wasn't relevant to her day-to-day, was that the Hargrove Grand had been sold 8 months ago. Not the whole company, not the brand. Just this property, along with 3 others in the Atlantic portfolio, quietly transferred as part of a private equity restructuring that had been handled entirely above her level. The new ownership group had a name that appeared nowhere in her employment correspondence: Calloway and Marsh Holdings. And the man who controlled 54% of that group, the man who had been standing quietly by the front door that morning, was named Theodore Marsh. Not Theo, not Mr. Marsh, not yet. Just a man in a canvas jacket who she'd told to move. Theodore Marsh had driven up from Lunenburg that morning. 4 hours, mostly highway, with a thermos of coffee that had gone cold somewhere past Bridgewater. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. That was deliberate. He'd learned years ago that announced visits produced performances, not information. If he wanted to know how a property actually ran, he walked in like a guest, or in this case, like a man who didn't belong. He stood near the entrance and watched the lobby for 20 minutes before anyone spoke to him. He was 51. His hair had gone gray at the temples in his 40s, which he'd never minded. He'd built his first real estate position out of a single undervalued commercial block in Dartmouth when he was 29, sold it, bought 2 more, and spent the next 2 decades acquiring distressed hospitality properties in Atlantic Canada and nursing them back. He had a gift for it. Not the finance part, though he was capable there, but the human part. He could walk into a hotel and feel within an hour whether the staff trusted their leadership, whether the culture was fear-based or earned, whether the person at the top was protecting the place or just managing their own career. He stood by the door that morning and watched. The lobby was clean. The front desk staff moved with confidence. A young man named, he squinted at the name tag, Colin, was handling a complicated checkout situation with a family of 4 and doing it warmly. The restaurant entrance smelled like fresh bread and good coffee. Housekeeping was moving quietly through the corridor to the left, unhurried, professional. He was nodding slowly to himself when the woman in the charcoal blazer walked past him and told him to move. He moved. He noted the lanyard around her neck. General manager. He noted that she didn't look back. He found a chair near the window overlooking the harbor and sat down with his cold coffee and spent another 40 minutes watching. It was Colin, the front desk agent, who eventually came over to ask if he needed anything. "I'm fine, thank you," Theodore said. "I have a meeting in a bit, with someone staying with us, with the general manager, actually, though she doesn't know it yet." Colin blinked. I can let Ms. Calloway know you're here, if you'd like. What name should I give?" "Marsh," he said. "She'll want to look it up first." "That's fine." Colin returned to the desk. Theodore watched him type something, then stop, then type something else. He watched the young man's expression change, not dramatically, just a small recalibration, the kind that happens when the ground shifts slightly underfoot. Colin picked up the phone, spoke quietly, listened, set it down. He came back looking slightly uncertain. "Mrs. Calloway is in a meeting with a contractor at the moment. She asked if you could wait. She'll be with you as soon as she's done." Theodore looked at him. How long? She wasn't sure. Possibly 45 minutes. That's fine, he said. I'll wait. He meant it. He'd been doing this long enough to know that how a property treated someone they'd just discovered was important was equally telling as how they'd treated him when they thought he was nobody. He settled back in the chair. 22 minutes later, Serena Calloway came across the lobby toward him. She walked quickly, the way people walk when they're recalculating mid-stride. He stood up. She was taller than he'd registered that morning. Late 30s, maybe just past 40. She carried herself with the kind of posture that came not from arrogance, but from years of being the person in the room who had to project certainty even when she didn't feel it. He recognized it. He'd worked alongside people like that his whole career, and the best of them, the ones who actually deserved the authority they'd built, also carried a slight tension behind the eyes. A permanent awareness that the whole thing could unravel if you let your attention slip. Serena had that. It wasn't a weakness. It was, in his experience, a sign. "Mr. Marsh," she said, and extended her hand. Her voice was steady. "Good. I apologize for the wait. I wasn't expecting you today." "I know," he said. "That's usually the point." She absorbed that without flinching. "Would you like to use the boardroom or the restaurant?" "We have a private section in the back. Restaurant," he said. "I'd like to see the lunch service." She ordered a coffee. He ordered coffee and a bowl of the chowder because it was Nova Scotia and you could always tell something about a kitchen by its chowder. It arrived in 4 minutes and it was very good. He noted that too. They spoke carefully at first. She had been briefed. He could tell. Someone had made calls in the 22 minutes she'd kept him waiting, given her the outline, but the briefing had been incomplete. She knew he was a significant stakeholder. She didn't know the full percentage. She didn't know that the board restructuring from 8 months ago had effectively made Calloway and Marsh Holdings the controlling interest in this property, which meant that in any vote that mattered, he was the vote that mattered. He wasn't going to lead with that. "The Q3 numbers," he said. 78%. "That's real." "It is," she said. "Labor cost per occupied room has gone up 11% year over year." She didn't hesitate. "Yes, I made a decision 18 months ago to stop running a skeleton crew. We were losing experienced staff to the Westin and the Marriott because we couldn't match compensation. I increased base wages for front of house and housekeeping. The cost went up. So did retention. So did guest scores, turnover rate, down 63% from when I arrived." He looked at her. "I have the numbers if you'd like to see them," she said. "I have all the numbers. I believe you," he said. And he did. What followed over the next 2 hours was not a standard investor meeting. Theodore had been in enough of those to know what they felt like. The curated presentations, the selective data, the practiced answers to anticipated questions. This was different. Serena Calloway walked him through the property the way someone walks through a place they actually care about. She knew the name of the woman who had run housekeeping for 11 years and had nearly quit 18 months ago over a scheduling dispute that her predecessor had mishandled. She knew that the restaurant's pastry chef was being quietly recruited by a new hotel opening in Dartmouth and that she'd already had a conversation with him about a compensation review. She knew that the elevator in the East Wing had a subtle rattle on the descent that guests occasionally mentioned, that the repair had been quoted at $38,000, and that she'd budgeted for it in the next fiscal year. She knew her hotel. Theodore had owned properties where the GM could not tell him the name of a single long-serving staff member without checking a list. He'd owned properties where deferred maintenance had been hidden from investors for years behind healthy-looking surface numbers. He had bought 3 hotels in the past decade specifically because the GM was protecting their numbers more carefully than they were protecting the property itself. The Hargrove was not that. They ended up on the rooftop, mid-afternoon, the lunch service below them done, and the dinner prep not yet started. The harbor was flat and silver in the October light. He stood at the railing and looked out and was quiet for a moment. "The board is going to recommend a management restructuring," he said. "End of quarter. They want to consolidate oversight of the Atlantic properties under a single regional director. Someone they'll bring in externally." He felt her go still beside him. "They haven't told you," he said. "It wasn't a question." "No," she said. After a moment, "Is that why you're here?" "Partly." She was quiet. He watched her absorb it, the way she kept her face arranged, the way her hands stayed loose on the railing. She wasn't going to perform distress in front of someone she'd met 4 hours ago. He respected that. "And the other part?" she asked. "I wanted to see the property myself before I decided how I felt about it." "And?" He turned to look at her directly. "The board's recommendation is not binding without my vote, and I haven't voted yet." The board meeting was scheduled for the second Thursday in November. Serena spent the 2.5 weeks between Theodore's visit and that meeting doing something she hadn't done in 3 years. She went back to basics. Not because she was panicking. Not exactly. But because Theodore's visit had clarified something she'd let blur at the edges. She had been so focused on the metrics, occupancy, revenue per available room, cost per occupied room, guest scores, that she had occasionally let the texture of the thing slip, the human texture, and she understood now, watching the way he had moved through the property, what he was actually measuring. She had conversations she'd been deferring. With the pastry chef, whose name was Brendan, and who, when she sat down with him honestly, admitted he wasn't actually certain he wanted to leave. He just wanted to know the Hargrove valued him. She renegotiated his contract. She met with the housekeeping team, not a memo, not an email, but a room, and chairs and coffee, and her actually sitting there, and listened to the things that had been accumulating. Small things. Scheduling things. A locker room that needed a basic renovation. A cart system that was outdated and making the job physically harder than it needed to be. She had the budget for most of it. She had been holding it unconsciously for projects that felt more visible. She let it go. She also called the board chair, a man named Warren who operated out of Toronto and who had, in her experience, a talent for making decisions about people without ever actually meeting them. She told him directly that she'd met with Theodore Marsh, that she was aware of the restructuring proposal, and that she'd like to present her case before any vote was taken. Warren was quiet for a moment. "That's not typically how this works, Serena." "I know," she said, "but Mr. Marsh came to the property himself. I think it's reasonable to extend the same consideration to the person who's been running it." Another pause. "I'll see what I can arrange." What he arranged was 15 minutes at the start of the board meeting, before the main agenda. Serena drove to Toronto. She didn't bring a presentation deck. She brought the numbers, printed, clean, clearly sourced, and she brought something she had never thought to bring to a board meeting before. She brought Brendan's renewal agreement, the updated housekeeping schedule, and a short letter that Colin from the front desk had written without being asked, after he'd heard through the staff grapevine that the hotel's management structure was under review. The letter was 3 paragraphs. It said, in the particular earnest and unpolished way of someone who didn't write letters often, what it had meant to him to work somewhere that had started to feel, over the past 3 years, like a place worth being. She hadn't asked him to write it. She hadn't known about it until he slid it under her office door 2 days before she flew out. She read it at the board table in Toronto while Warren and 4 other men looked on, and she kept her voice perfectly steady, and she set it down. "I'm not here to argue that I'm irreplaceable," she said. "I'm here to show you what replacement would cost. Not financially. I have those numbers too, and they're in the packet. I mean, what it would cost the people who have built something real at this property." Theodore Marsh was at the end of the table. He had said nothing yet. She looked at him last. "You came to see the hotel," she said. "I think you saw it. The vote was 4-2 in favor of the restructuring proposal. Theodore voted against. Under the terms of the ownership agreement, a vote from the controlling interest, meaning a vote from Calloway and Marsh Holdings, meaning ultimately a vote from Theodore, on any matter of property-level management carried a weighted value of 1.5. The effective result of the vote was not 4-2 in favor. It was 4-3 against. The restructuring did not proceed. Warren called Serena afterward, not to congratulate her. He wasn't the type, but to let her know the outcome and to suggest, in the careful language of someone managing their own position, that she might consider building a stronger relationship with the board going forward. "I appreciate that, Warren," she said. And she meant it, mostly. What she hadn't expected was the phone call from Theodore 3 days later. He was calling from Lunenburg, she imagined. She'd looked it up after his visit, a small historic town on the South Shore, a UNESCO site, the kind of place that seemed improbable as a home base for someone with his portfolio. But she was beginning to understand that improbability was something he was comfortable with. "I wanted to tell you something," he said, "that I probably should have said in the room." "All right." The board's instinct wasn't entirely wrong. The Atlantic properties do need more coordination. The Hargrove is the strongest of the 4, but there are gaps elsewhere, particularly in Moncton and in the Cape Breton property, where the absence of regional oversight is showing up in the numbers. She waited. "I'd like to propose a different structure to the board. One where the regional coordination role is built from within rather than imported, where the person leading it already knows what these properties are supposed to feel like." Serena was quiet for a moment. Outside her office window, the harbor was the same flat silver it had been on the rooftop the afternoon of his visit. "You're offering me the regional role," she said. "I'm suggesting it as a possibility. You'd keep oversight of the Hargrove directly, at least through the transition." The other 3 properties would report to you. It would mean more travel, more complexity, and you'd be taking on problems that aren't of your making in properties that don't look like this one yet. Yet, she said. Yet, he agreed. She thought about Colin's letter, still folded in her bag from the Toronto meeting. She thought about Brendan in the kitchen downstairs, who had stayed. She thought about the housekeeping cart system she'd finally ordered, and the locker room renovation that had been scheduled for January, and the elevator in the east wing that was going to get fixed in the spring. She thought about the man in the canvas jacket she had told to move. I would need to meet the teams at the other properties, she said, before I agree to anything. I won't take on responsibility for people I haven't spoken to. I'd expect nothing less. And I want the regional role to have actual authority, not an advisory function. Real decision-making capacity, with board accountability that goes through me, not around me. That's negotiable but not unreasonable. I'd also like you to come back to the Hargrove, she said. Not for a meeting. Just I'd like you to see it again in 6 months, when the work we've started is further along. There was a brief silence on the line. I can do that, he said. She took the role. The months that followed were not easy. The Moncton property was struggling in ways that the numbers had understated. A staff culture that had curdled under a previous manager who'd been let go too late. A maintenance backlog that was going to require hard conversations with the board about capital investment. A restaurant that had been coasting on a reputation it had stopped earning 3 years ago. The Cape Breton Hotel was smaller but had a different problem. It was actually well run by a team that had been systematically under-recognized, their requests for resources repeatedly deprioritized in favor of the higher-profile Halifax property. That one hurt her. She sat with the GM in Cape Breton, a woman named Ruth, who had been with the property for 14 years, and who had the same look Serena had seen in her own mirror in the early days, the look of someone carrying more than the job description accounted for. And she listened for 2 hours. And she came back to Halifax and spent a long evening writing a capital request to the board that she knew would be uncomfortable. Theodore co-signed it. The board approved it. Ruth cried when Serena called to tell her. Not obviously, she was professional about it. But Serena heard it in the pause before Ruth said thank you, and she understood it completely. Theodore came back to the Hargrove in May, as he'd said he would. Not announced, same as before, though this time she saw him in the lobby from across the room. That canvas jacket was becoming recognizable, and she finished the conversation she was in and walked over to meet him. They did the restaurant again. The chowder again, though this time she ordered one too. The harbor was different in May. The light was warmer. The boats were back. And they sat for a long time after the meal was technically done, talking about things that were not strictly about the hotels. He told her about Lunenburg, about why he'd landed there, a property he'd bought in his 30s that he'd intended to flip, but had ended up keeping because he couldn't bring himself to change what it was. About a fishing boat he'd learned to handle badly in his 40s and now handled adequately. About the way the Atlantic portfolio had started as a financial thesis and had become over the years something he didn't have a clean word for. A responsibility, she offered. Maybe, he said. Or a community, something you didn't expect to care about as much as you do. She looked out at the harbor. I told you to move, she said, that morning. When you were standing by the door, you did. I didn't look back. No. She turned to face him. I'm sorry for that. He was quiet for a moment. You were managing your hotel. I was standing in the way. You weren't, though. You were watching. There's a difference. He looked at her with something that might have been amusement, or might have been something more considered than that. There is, he said. That's a good thing to know. The regional structure took 18 months to fully establish. By the end of it, the Moncton property had turned over its restaurant leadership, recalibrated its staffing model, and was running at an occupancy rate 12 points higher than when Serena had started. The Cape Breton Hotel had received its capital investment, and Ruth had stopped looking like someone carrying too much. The fourth property, a smaller inn outside Fredericton, had required the least intervention. It just needed someone to pay attention to it, which it now had. The board, including Warren, stopped questioning the regional structure. Not because they were convinced it was right. Boards rarely admitted that, but because the numbers were difficult to argue with, and because Theodore Marsh remained clear in every meeting and every vote about where his confidence sat. Serena kept her office at the Hargrove. She would always keep it there, she suspected. The harbor in the morning, the staff she'd watched grow, the elevator in the east wing that now ran smoothly and silently. The locker room that smelled like fresh paint and had a long bench and adequate lighting, and a small thing on the wall that said, in block letters that housekeeping had apparently put up themselves, We take care of this place. This place takes care of us. She hadn't asked anyone to put that up. She didn't know exactly when it had appeared, but she left it there. It seemed, all things considered, like the right thing to do.